Whispers Beneath Floorboards, a scary story from Reddit. Subscribe to Scary Stories Vault for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. David had always known there was something unsettling about his childhood home. The creaking floors, the drafty windows, the way shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. He had grown up accustomed to these things, but nothing had prepared him for the deep emptiness that settled into the house after his mother passed away. Her death had been sudden, a heart attack in the middle of the night. He had barely had time to say goodbye before the paramedics whisked her away. Now, the house that had once felt familiar, even comforting, seemed hollow, a place without warmth. The days after the funeral were a blur. Friends and distant relatives came and went, offering their condolences, but David remained numb to their words. The sympathy in their eyes felt like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He found himself retreating into silence, unwilling to speak about his grief, unwilling to confront the gaping hole left by his mother's absence. He spent his days mechanically going through the motions, eating, working, sleeping, but there was no joy in any of it. The nights were worse. That particular evening, David sat on the couch, flipping mindlessly through channels on the television. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the fridge from the kitchen. His mother's things were still everywhere. Her favorite blanket draped over the armchair, her shoes by the front door, her knitting basket half filled with an unfinished scarf. He hadn't had the heart to move anything yet. It was almost as if, by keeping her belongings in place, he could delay accepting that she was truly gone. As the hours dragged on, he decided it was time for bed. He had work in the morning, and though his body screamed for rest, his mind refused to comply. The house seemed darker than usual as he made his way upstairs, the shadows deeper and more menacing. He chalked it up to his frayed nerves, telling himself it was all in his head. Grief could play tricks on a person's mind after all. David settled into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, as if the simple act of cocooning himself would keep the world at bay. He stared up at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of the house. It was an old place. His mother had inherited it from her parents, and it had its quirks. The floorboards shifted, the pipes groaned, and the wind always seemed to find a way to sneak through the cracks in the windows. These were sounds he had heard his entire life, yet tonight they felt different. A loud thud echoed from downstairs. David sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. It had sounded like something had fallen in the kitchen. He listened, straining his ears, but there was nothing more, just silence. He debated whether to get up and investigate, but exhaustion weighed him down. Maybe something had simply tipped over, a box, or maybe one of the dishes left drying on the counter. He would check in the morning, he decided. But just as he was about to lie back down, he heard it again, a low, creaking sound, like the kitchen door slowly opening. His stomach tightened with unease. He was certain he had locked the door before heading upstairs. His mind raced, running through possibilities. Could someone have broken in? The neighborhood had always been safe, but there had been a few burglaries in nearby towns recently. Or maybe it was just the wind. Sometimes the old door didn't latch properly, and a strong gust could push it open. He got out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat he kept under his bed, a habit from his teenage years when he had been paranoid about intruders. Quietly, he made his way downstairs, his bare feet padding softly on the wooden steps. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen was watching him. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and with each step, the feeling of dread grew stronger. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw it. The kitchen door was wide open, the soft glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows across the floor. His heart thudded in his chest. He tightened his grip on the bat and cautiously approached the door. The night was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes darting around, searching for anything out of place, and then he saw it. standing in the doorway. A figure. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a woman, an old woman, her face obscured by the darkness, but her presence unmistakable. She stood still, her head slightly tilted, as if she were watching him. She was dressed in a long, white gown, her hands folded in front of her, her posture unnervingly calm. For a moment, David couldn't move. His mind scrambled to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this a dream? Was this a dream? Was he imagining things? He blinked, but the figure remained, her outline sharp and defined in the dim light. The bat felt heavy in his hand, but his arms refused to move. His body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, the woman took a step forward. David's paralysis broke. With a strangled gasp, he stumbled backward, dropping the bat as he turned and ran. He bolted up the stairs, his heart hammering in his chest, every instinct in his body screaming at him to get away. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the pounding of his feet on the steps, but behind him there was only silence. He didn't stop until he was in his bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it. His hands were trembling, his whole body shaking with adrenaline. He pressed his back against the door, struggling to catch his breath. What had he just seen? Was that a ghost? He had never believed in such things. But what else could explain the figure in the doorway? No one else was in the house, and the front door had been locked. David grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed 911. The operator answered, and he stammered through his explanation, his voice barely above a whisper as he told her about the intruder. They promised to send someone over right away. He sat on the floor, his back still pressed against the door, waiting. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. He didn't dare move, his eyes fixed on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. When the police finally arrived, they searched the entire house. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. The officer in charge, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, told David that it was likely just his imagination, that the stress of losing his mother was playing tricks on him. He wanted to believe that, but he couldn't shake the image of the woman in the white gown from his mind. After the police left, David sat in silence, staring at the spot where the woman had stood. He told himself it was over, that it had been a hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. He would hear footsteps in the hall when no one was there. Doors would open and close on their own, and once he came home to find every single cabinet in the kitchen wide open. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had left them open by accident. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One night, a week after the first encounter, David was lying in bed when he heard it again, the sound of the kitchen door creaking open. His blood ran cold. He knew what was coming, but this time he couldn't bring himself to go downstairs. Instead, he lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards as someone or something moved through the house. And then, the footsteps stopped, right outside his bedroom door. David held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He could hear the soft sound of breathing just on the other side of the door. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. David bolted upright, scrambling out of bed, his mind racing. He needed to get out, to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The door opened a crack, just enough for him to see the figure standing in the hallway. The same woman, her long white gown billowing around her like mist, her face still obscured by shadow. But this time, there was something different. Her hand, pale and withered, reached out toward him. "No," David whispered, backing away. "Please, no." The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hand hovered just inches from his face, and for a moment he thought she was going to touch him, but then she spoke. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it sent chills down his spine. "David, David." He froze. How did she know his name? "David," she repeated, her voice filled with sorrow. His mind raced. Help her? Help her with what? He didn't understand. Before he could respond, she was gone. Vanished, as if she had never been there at all. David stood in the middle of his room, trembling. He didn't know what to think. Was he losing his mind? Had the grief finally driven him over the edge? Or was there something more going on? Something he couldn't explain? The next day, David did some research on the house. He dug through old records, hoping to find some explanation for the woman's appearance. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. The house had once belonged to a woman named Margaret Thompson, an elderly widow who had lived there alone for many years. She had died in the house, under mysterious circumstances. Some people said it was a heart attack. Others whispered that she had been murdered. But there were rumors. Rumors that Margaret's spirit had never left the house, that she was still searching for something or someone. David realized with a sickening certainty that the woman he had seen was Margaret, and she wasn't going to leave him alone until he helped her. David couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in the pit of his stomach after learning about Margaret Thompson. Her story felt like a warning, a shadow of something far darker lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't just the idea of a ghost haunting his home that terrified him. It was the thought that Margaret might not be alone in her suffering. What if there was more to her death than anyone knew? He spent the next few days trying to gather more information about Margaret's life. The local library had old newspaper clippings from decades ago, yellowed and brittle with age. He sat in the dimly lit corner, flipping through the papers, his heart racing with every new discovery. The articles were vague, most of them only mentioning her passing briefly, attributing it to a heart attack. But the whispers of something more sinister were there, hiding between the lines, waiting to be uncovered. One article caught his eye. It wasn't about Margaret's death, but rather about the years leading up to it. She had been a well-known figure in the town. Kind, generous, always willing to help others. But there was one incident that stood out. A young girl had gone missing around the same time Margaret's health began to decline. The police had questioned everyone in the area, but no one could offer any leads. The girl had simply vanished without a trace, and Margaret, who had been one of the last people to see her, had been devastated by the loss. David's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of the story. Could it be possible that Margaret's death was somehow connected to the missing girl? The thought sent chills down his spine. He had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but the events of the past few weeks had shaken that belief to its core. That night, as he lay in bed, the weight of everything he had learned pressed down on him. Sleep seemed impossible. Every creak of the house made him jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist into something menacing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Margaret was waiting for him to do something, to help her in some way. It wasn't long before the familiar creaking of the floorboards reached his ears again. The kitchen door had opened once more. This time, though, he didn't hesitate. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Grabbing a flashlight from his bedside table, he steeled himself and made his way downstairs. The kitchen was empty, just as it had been the last time. But this time something was different. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. And then there she was, Margaret, standing in the doorway just as she had before. But this time, her face was more visible. David's breath caught in his throat, but he forced himself to speak. "What do you want?" His voice came out in a shaky whisper, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. For a long moment, Margaret didn't respond. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. But then slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed. At first, David didn't understand what she was trying to show him, but then his eyes followed the direction of her finger. She was pointing toward the floor, more specifically, toward one of the old wooden floorboards near the kitchen table. Swallowing hard, David stepped closer. The floorboard looked ordinary enough, but something about it felt wrong. Tentatively, he knelt down and pressed his fingers against the wood. It was loose. His heart skipped a beat. With trembling hands, he pried the board up, revealing a small, dusty compartment hidden beneath. Inside, there was a single object, an old, weathered locket. David picked it up carefully, turning it over in his hands. The locket was tarnished with age, the delicate chain broken in several places, but when he opened it, his breath caught in his throat. Inside the locket was a photograph, faded, but still recognizable. It was a picture of Margaret, much younger, standing beside a little girl, the same little girl who had gone missing all those years ago. David's mind reeled. Why was this hidden beneath the floor? What had Margaret been hiding? Before he could process the implications, a soft voice whispered behind him. She never left. David whipped around, but Margaret was gone. The kitchen was empty once again, and the only sound was the rapid beating of his own heart. The words echoed in his mind. She never left. What did that mean? Was the girl still here in some way? The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. David couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched, that something, someone, was always just out of sight, lingering in the shadows. He tried to tell himself that it was just his imagination, but deep down, he knew better. One evening, he decided to confront the truth. He couldn't live like this anymore, constantly on edge, always looking over his shoulder. He needed to know what had really happened in the house. Armed with the locket and a growing sense of dread, he went back to the library to dig deeper into the town's records. It took hours of searching, but finally, he found what he was looking for, an old, forgotten police report about the missing girl. Her name had been Emily, and she had been Margaret's neighbor. According to the report, Emily had often visited Margaret's house, as the elderly woman had taken a liking to her. But then, one day, Emily had disappeared, and no one had seen her since. The report mentioned that Margaret had been questioned extensively, but there had never been enough evidence to implicate her in the girl's disappearance. The case had gone cold, and Margaret had lived out the rest of her days in the shadow of suspicion. David couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for Margaret. Whether she had been involved in the girl's disappearance or not, she had lived a lonely, tragic life, but as much as he wanted to believe that Margaret had been innocent, the locket told a different story. There was something more going on, something darker. That night, David returned home with a sense of determination. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. He had to find out the truth, whatever it might be. The house was silent when he arrived, the darkness pressing in from all sides. But as he stood in the doorway, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was it, the moment of truth. He made his way to the kitchen, where he had first seen Margaret. The floorboard was still loose, the hidden compartment empty now that he had removed the locket. He knelt down and stared at the space, his mind racing. What was he missing? And then he heard it. A soft, distant voice, almost like a child's whisper. "Help me." David's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from below. Without thinking, he grabbed a flashlight and pried up more of the floorboards, revealing a narrow, hidden staircase leading down into the darkness. His hands shook as he descended, the air growing colder with each step. The smell of damp earth filled his nostrils, and his flashlight flickered as if it, too, was afraid of what lay ahead. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, dirt-floored room. The walls were lined with old, rotting wooden shelves, and in the center of the room was a single object, a small, rusted trunk. David's heart pounded in his chest as he approached it. every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. With trembling hands, he opened the trunk. Inside, he found what he had been dreading: the skeletal remains of a child, curled up in the fetal position. A faded pink ribbon was still tied around the girl's hair, the same ribbon that the girl in the photograph had worn. David stumbled back, his mind reeling. This was it. This was what Margaret had been hiding all those years. Emily hadn't just disappeared. She had been buried here, beneath the house, hidden away where no one would ever find her. But why? Why had Margaret done this? As if in response to his unspoken question, the air in the room grew colder, and the soft sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned, and there she was, Margaret, standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You have to help her," she whispered, her voice trembling with guilt. "She never left because I couldn't let her go." David's breath caught in his throat. He understood now. Margaret had loved Emily, but something had gone horribly wrong. Whether it had been an accident or something more sinister, Margaret had never been able to forgive herself. She had buried the truth, both literally and figuratively, but Emily's spirit had remained trapped, unable to move on. Tears welled up in David's eyes as he realized what he had to do. He had to give Emily the peace she deserved. He called the police that night, telling them about the discovery in his basement. It didn't take long for the investigators to piece together the truth. Margaret had never meant to harm Emily, but the guilt of her actions had haunted her until the day she died, and now, with the truth finally revealed, both she and Emily could find peace. As the police carried Emily's remains away, David stood in the doorway, watching them go. The house felt different now, lighter, somehow, as if the weight of years of sorrow had been lifted. And for the first time since his mother's death, David felt a sense of closure. The house might still be old and creaky, but it was no longer haunted by the ghosts of the past. Or so he hoped.